Alright guys, we've added a crap ton of stuff to this data pack already. Go watch these videos so I don't have to take up time talking about it here. Today we're adding Remote Bombs and Stasis. These are a lot more simple than Cryonis and Magnesis, so grab a snack and let's talk about why. Also, subscribe and turn on notifications. I barely upload, so it's not like you'll be getting spammed anyway. Let's start with Remote Bombs. Quick summary of how they work. One's a sphere, one's a cube, and the only real difference between them is that one's good for rolling and the other's good for sitting in place. If you use the rune to create a bomb while you're standing on the ground, it'll appear in your hands. You can then either throw it or place it at your feet. If you use the rune while you're off the ground, it'll just appear at your feet. Using the rune again will detonate the bomb. I'd been thinking about how I'd implement them before I even decided to go through with any of the runes at all. I'd seen other people's versions, mostly just using raw TNT, and while I was impressed, I wanted to do something special. I decided that I'd use a custom player head for the official look of the bombs. The three remaining problems were creating a bomb when the rune gets triggered, dealing with the motion and the physics of the bombs while they're alive, and creating an explosion when it gets detonated with another right click. The physics of the bomb was the hardest part, so let's talk about that first. My first thought was to write a whole new physics system for both bombs. I'd add friction with the ground, gravity, wall collisions, all that jazz. You might think we could just spawn the armor stand and immediately give it the correct motion, letting the game handle the physics, but look at the path that armor stands take when they're sent horizontally. Mobs, including armor stands, always have a very strong horizontal motion decay, also known as drag. When you throw a ball in real life, its motion creates an almost perfect parabola, this nice symmetrical curve. That's the physics that Breath of the Wild adheres to. Minecraft doesn't. Look at the path that these armor stands take. That's not symmetrical, that's Smash Bros. Balloon physics. If you throw a bomb using this data pack, you don't want it to stop moving horizontally half a second after you throw it. Can you imagine if you shot an arrow but it took a flight path like that? On that note, there are other entities we can use, like arrows, that don't have this extreme amount of drag. Projectiles, experience orbs, falling block entities, and one or two other types of entities have very minimal amounts of drag, so one of those would be ideal. I'm just going to say right now, no to falling blocks. I don't want the player to throw a bomb that ends up placing some random block on the ground where there shouldn't be one. I could have the falling block ride another entity so that it never actually touches the ground, but then the motion wouldn't be controlled by the falling block anymore, so there wouldn't be a point in having it anyway. Experience orbs could be good, except that I don't want their motion to be thrown off by nearby players. Bombs don't gravitate towards you in Breath of the Wild, so they shouldn't do so here. I mentioned arrows earlier, why not use those? Their behavior gets weird to work with once they've hit the ground. It might be alright for square bombs since those aren't supposed to move much after they hit the ground, but round bombs need to keep moving for a while even after that. Plus, there's nothing I can do to hide arrows. Snowballs, however, are a different story. You can change the texture to any other item you choose. Want to throw TNT? Go for it. End crystals? Sure. Arrows? Weird flex, but okay. Ideally, I would find some glitch texture that's invisible and use that as a snowball texture. Back in my glory days, there was always something you could use, like a piston head block in item form. Should be super easy, barely an inconvenience. The problem with snowballs is that they break when they hit the ground. I figured I could just summon a new snowball with no gravity when that happens, copy the most recent horizontal movement of the old snowball to the new one, then continue teleporting the armor stand to the new snowball. Then I realized what an absolutely garbage idea that was. Snowballs aren't the only entity whose texture can be changed. Item entities exist. Oh, but Howzieky, items can burn and they can despawn and they can be picked up. Counterpoint. Commands. Back to physics. Look at the path that this armor stand takes through the air. Now compared to an item entity. This is awesome. It's almost an actual parabola. That makes the item entity good enough for handling all the airborne physics of both bombs, but what about when they're on the ground? Well, it's actually fine for square bombs. They're supposed to sit still after landing, so this is perfect. The main issue comes with round bombs. They're supposed to keep moving after they land, but as soon as they touch the ground, their drag gets way stronger. So what if I just tell them they aren't actually touching the ground? Let's try this. Every tick, check if the on-ground property of the round bomb item is 1. If it is, set it to 0 and remove the gravity of the item so it doesn't hit the ground again. Boom, it works. Well, except for one thing. The item isn't trying to hit the ground anymore, so it doesn't care when the ground is gone. This means that we're going to have to look for the ground ourselves, and if we find that there is no ground below the item, we just give the item back its gravity. This is almost perfect, just missing one thing. Things in real life aren't supposed to be able to hang over ledges like this, and they don't in Breath of the Wild. So we'll also watch for when two corners of an item's hitbox are hanging over a ledge. If that's happening, we'll accelerate it in that direction. There's only so much you can do with the physics of a sphere when every surface is perfectly level, but I'm happy with how this works. You can even curve shots if you aim it right. Now the physics are done. Physics is physics a plural word? Remember how I said that there were three main problems to solve? I thought so at first too, but there's more to consider. First, the item that the armor stand is getting teleported to needs to be invisible, and there should be cool particles like there are in Breath of the Wild. The particles are easy, but the invisible item thing isn't nearly as trivial as I hoped. You used to be able to get the raw item form of any block. You could get fire, water, piston heads, broken stuff like that, but Mojang has really been on top of it with the bug fixing. That said, I am still left without a way to use invisible items. I even tried using an air item, but when you use an item ID that isn't actually obtainable, it seems like Minecraft just deletes the item entity. If anyone knows a workaround, please let me know. I read every single comment. My only remaining options were to either use an item that's so small it's unnoticeable, or change the texture of an existing item to be completely transparent. Normally I'd avoid changing textures because I see anything further from vanilla than a datapack as a sin, but hey. We're already using a resource pack for the Sheikah Slate. Alright, and now the item is invisible and all you can see is the bomb. Oh, also here's a Soulfire flame particle to match those wavy lines from Breath of the Wild. When I was testing this stuff, I threw a bomb through lava. It suddenly looked so much better. Turns out, things glow when they're on fire. And the fire animation doesn't appear because I used the armor stand's invisible NBT tag. Why do invisible armor stands show armor but not fire? I don't know, but I'm not going to ask because it makes life better for me. This looks amazing, but it goes away when these bombs touch water. Obviously. Oh, I forgot to mention that I added better water floating physics to the bombs, too. Anyway, I was kind of bummed that the water ruined this neat effect, but it would be too slow to check every tick if it needs to be reignited again, so I just decided to let it go. But then, I kid you not, a snapshot came out the next day, and Mojang added a new NBT tag called Has Visual Fire that makes entities look like they're on fire without any of the actual functionality. Using this tag, I can have a nice glow for the bombs and I don't have to worry about the glow getting put out. Finally, creating and detonating bombs. For creating bombs, I decided that I wouldn't make it so the player holds the bomb before placing or throwing it. I figured that it would be too complicated. If you want to throw it, use the rune while standing. If you want it at your feet, jump first. I guess I could make it so that if you right click, the bomb is visually attached to you, then you can click to throw it or shift to place it. Would you guys want that? Now that I think about it, it might not be too hard. Anyway, as for detonating bombs, I'll just summon a creeper, delete the item and the armor stand, and create some explosion particles. If both bombs are near each other, they'll both detonate. If you go too far away from either bomb, that bomb will despawn. And that concludes Remote Bombs. We're on to the final rune, Stasis. So, see you guys in a year. Just kidding. In Breath of the Wild, if you use stasis on a monster or object, it gets frozen in place for a length of time that depends on its size. While frozen, you can hit whatever you froze to store up kinetic energy. Once the timer runs out, all of the stored up kinetic energy gets released at once, sending the object flying in the direction that it was most recently hit. For this data pack, here are the steps. When the player is holding the Sheikah Slate in stasis mode, highlight all entities that can be stasised. If the player is looking at an entity that can be stasised, change that entity's highlight to green. From here we have some sub-steps. First, let's just get freezing and unfreezing working. For freezing, we just need to create particles, set the entity's motion to 0, turn off their gravity and AI, and extinguish them if they're on fire. We should also make them invulnerable because we don't want them to be able to die while they're frozen. The only way to kill something in Breath of the Wild that you've used stasis on is with an ancient arrow. So freezing is pretty simple, but unfreezing is a little more complicated. It's fine if stasis was used on an entity that was stationary and not on fire, but if it used to be moving, all that motion will have been lost, which ruins the illusion that it had in Breath of the Wild that it's just temporarily paused. Not to mention the fire NBT data is being lost as well. So before we overwrite each of these values in the first place, we should keep track of what they were. That way when they're unfrozen, we can just give it back to them. There, now they continue their lives exactly how they used to before stasis was used on them. Next, we need to figure out how to store up kinetic energy. Obviously, we want the player to be able to just hit them, which leads us to the conclusion that we should just track how much damage the entity takes. But right now we're making the entity invulnerable to prevent the player from killing them. If the player has the invulnerable 1 tag, then they can't take any damage at all from players who aren't in creative mode, so there would be nothing for us to keep track of in the first place. This means that instead of making the entity invulnerable, we should just give them an insane amount of health. Yes, a strong enough weapon could theoretically one-shot them, but realistically, it won't happen. If something insane changes about Minecraft or this data pack and entities start getting killed while they're in stasis, then I can change how this works. For now, we'll stick to keeping track of how much damage the entity has taken. When the entity does take damage, we'll add the amount of health it's lost to a total, put its health back to full, and turn the entity's eyes to face the same direction that the player was looking when it was hit. Once the timer runs out, we'll launch the entity in the direction that it's looking, scaling its speed with the total amount of damage taken while it was in stasis. Alright, this all works for entities that take damage when hit. What about entities that don't? When you hit a minecart, your damage dealt statistic doesn't actually rise. This is the same with boats, arrows, items, ender pearls, falling blocks, and other stuff like that. That means that if we want to be able to use stasis on them, we'll need to do a little something extra. We want the player to experience the exact same behavior regardless of what they freeze, so whatever we do here should be invisible to them. How about using an invisible slime to keep track of damage dealt and launch direction? This is especially nice because we can use different slime sizes for different size entities, which is necessary with stuff like minecarts because we don't want the player to be able to actually break the minecart. We want the slime to completely envelop the minecart, or whatever it is. Oh, and something I forgot to mention is the visual arrow that appears when something in stasis has kinetic energy. Back when I wrote this part of the datapack, I wanted to do everything with recursion, dynamically generating these shapes. If I were to do it over, I would write a Python script to pre-compute the different arrow sizes and colors, which would run more efficiently. It would take up more file space, needing a list of particles for each arrow size, but file size is not nearly as strict of a limit as Datapack performance is. Plus, writing Python scripts to generate particle-based effects is actually really fun. This is what electric effects look like now. If a video explaining particle effects like these is interesting to you, be sure to let me know in the comments. As for the timer itself, I recorded a clip in Breath of the Wild and I checked the frame counts for the stasis timer as it relates to different monster and object sizes. There are 3 different timer durations, and this is what I've translated them into in Minecraft. And with that, stasis is finished as well. Check this out. Even works on ender pearls, assuming you don't launch it out of simulation distance. If you do, it'll just be hanging at the chunk border until you get closer. Now remote bombs and stasis are done. That's it for this video. If you thought you saw a little something extra out of the corner of your eye, it was probably just your imagination.